Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all panelists and the participants or the listeners from around the globe. Welcome to this session titled Digital Technology to Enhance the Indigenous Languages and the literacy skills for Indigenous peoples, which has been organized on the auspicious occasions of the world's leading Summit on Human Rights in the Digital Age. My name is Dev Kumar Sunwar. I am the chairperson of Indigenous Television, which is a multilingual Indigenous community television channel in Nepal. And I'm also Asia Program Coordinator of the Cultural Survival. And I will be moderating the session. The digital technology has both the opportunity as well as the challenges. And UN has recently launched the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, starting from 2022 to 2032. During this decade, the opportunity is that the digital technology, which provides the opportunities for Indigenous peoples to enhance their languages or to have a presence of their languages in the digital world. And it will help to enhance literacy skills as well. So in order to speak on about this topic, I have invited a renowned speakers from Indigenous representatives and the digital media practitioners from Asia, Africa, Latin, and South America. And this the session will obviously explores the importance of digital platforms and challenges in accessing the informations and communication technologies, especially for Indigenous peoples in this digital age. And also this will explore the opportunities and challenges that Indigenous peoples are facing to access or having inclusion in the digital platform. So to start with the discussion, the first speaker I have invited, I would like to introduce is Nina Sangma. She comes from India. Currently, she holds the position of Communication Program Coordinator at the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, which is the umbrella organization of Indigenous peoples organizations in Asia. And she has been a radio, television, and digital journalist, and also a producer for over 17 years in a different mainstream Indian media conglomerates. And she is one of the first Indigenous journalists from the Garo Indigenous community from Northeast India. And her focus now is to create active spaces for Indigenous peoples in digital domains, where she is undertaking the advocacy as well as the media campaigns, which attempts to narrow the digital divides that has excluded the Indigenous peoples from meaningful representations and participations. So Nina, the first questions for the opening of our discussion I would like to ask you is, in this digital age, how important are the digital platform for the Asian Indigenous peoples in particular and Indigenous peoples in general? Nina.
Thank you so much for having me, Dave. It's a pleasure being on this panel. Well, to put it into context, I mean, of course, we know that it's important, right? I mean, especially post-COVID, where we've sort of had to, push ourselves into digital domains. We realized that the internet is a fundamental right, the access to it. So there are three basic areas that Indigenous peoples need to be included when you're talking about the internet as a whole. One is, of course, training, where, that training has many, many dimensions to it, whether it's technological skills, whether it's storytelling, whether it's, reaching out to your targeted audiences, how you advocate, etc. within that space, within those target groups, you also have very diverse groups, right, among indigenous people as well. And by which I mean, you sort of broadly divide them into native and non-native users of the internet, for example. The native internet users are obviously the ones who've grown up with smartphones in their hands, right? Like they're pretty good at navigating technologies, early adopters, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the older generation, right, who are still trying to navigate many different kinds of social media platforms, for example, wanting a lot of help and assistance, within their own family structures. And so while we're looking at training, we're also having to kind of customize those trainings for different kinds of indigenous peoples, right? The other aspect is providing devices, making sure that they have devices, which is, anything between smartphones to tablets to desktops. And the third aspect is internet access in itself, which is broadband access. Because, post-COVID, COVID itself is a multiplier. Whatever structural inequalities that have existed for indigenous peoples have been multiplied because of COVID, right? And that's how you're looking at the context of post-COVID, post-pandemic. What is that inclusion or exclusion looking like, for example, when it comes to internet as a fundamental right for people? So within that space, you're looking at who are your oppositions and what does that look like? In the digital domain, for example, the digital divide is you're looking at basically opposition from big tech. And by big tech, I mean platforms like Facebook, like Google. They are basically the guys who monopolize everything. Every product that you use at the moment is somewhere in our lived experiences, looking at them in our daily life. The other is big media, corporate media, which is in the Asian perspective, where there are shrinking civic spaces and there are, authoritarian regimes now. That means that space is shrinking even online, for example. And the dominant narratives are those of big media, coupled with the government centralized policies. So you're looking at this entire spectrum of the opposition that indigenous peoples have to account for. And that means essentially what I call beating the algorithm, which is if you're not being discovered on the internet, you're basically invisible, right? So how do we beat that? We don't have the kind of budgets that these guys have. You're looking at multi-million-dollar budgets. Organizationally, of course, we have funding, but then what do we do and how do we kind of, project and advocate for ourselves? So basically that's how important, obviously, the digital age, inclusion is in the digital age for indigenous peoples. Dave.
Thank you so much, Nina, for highlighting especially the fundamental rights, the aspects relating with the fundamental rights of indigenous peoples, in particular to have access to the internet, and some challenges in regards to the skills and the training to access to the digital platforms. From Asia, I would like to bring you the experiences of indigenous peoples from South America. And in order to speak on behalf of indigenous peoples of South America, I have invited David Hernandez Palmer. He comes from Wayu indigenous community in Venezuela. And he is the photographer, producer, filmmaker, journalist, and independent curators. And he programs and curates the International Indigenous Showcases of Venezuela, and produced by the Waqua Indigenous Audiovisual Foundation of Venezuela, and also Wayu Films and Video Showcases. And David is also a political advisor of a Latin American coordinator of Indigenous Peoples Films and Communications, in short, which is known as CLACP. So David, Nina previously shed light to some extent on the importance of digital platforms for Indigenous peoples in general. So highlighting more with the Asia, I would like to ask you, along with the importance of digital platforms, what are some of the challenges for indigenous peoples in general, or the indigenous peoples from South Americas are facing in terms of accessing the informations and communications, especially communication technologies?
Thanks, for the words, and thank Nina for opening. I think it is a very important context you provide to the people that is attending this session, because people that were here were coming from the global south. So by putting that in context, it will give you the notion about the inequity, and sometimes the largest digital gap that we can have as Indigenous peoples in comparison to peoples in Canada, US, New Zealand, Australia. So by keeping that in mind, we have to also mention that it is in global south where we have the greatest amount of biodiversity in languages, right? And yet only between 150 languages are used in cyberspace. So the most excluded languages in platforms are those languages from the global south. So by putting that in context, I think it is always good to mention that despite of that fact, we have initiatives, right? So I think it is very important to place the political approach to the international decade in indigenous languages, which is the rights of the speaker of an indigenous language, right? So what that means, to make sure that the speaker of that language uh, should be ensured, their basic human rights. But in this case, it's not only health, food, education, housing. It is also the right to technology, the right to use internet, the right to have access to uh, proper information when it's required, especially if that information is being kept away um, regards in a deeply uh, concerning way to their livelihood, right? So I think it is very important also to mention that even though we come from different cultures, different languages, and different country context, yet we are part of the global south. And so in this digital age, especially as Nina mentioned, pandemic has made us to reintroduce ourselves to the internet, collecting archives, collecting narratives, and put in the center how people had to sort their life out during the pandemic. Narratives that we have seen through in beekeepers, for instance, ladies from Mexico or Asia or other parts. So this, community narratives, we have seen to be flourished, to be put in the center again. So I think it is a metaphor, that our future is a return, not meaning that we're going backwards, not meaning that is precarious, but I think the way we have sustained life, it is also a way to empower the technologies, to understand that the very livelihoods is sustained with the ground, with the earth, but at the same time, like we have the right to also get not only literated in technology, but to understand that it is our right, because for the technology to be in the market, we have to, not because we want, but our very lands that are being exploited, because of resources to be, to have the technology around, and for other people to have it, more accessible for us. So I think, the message for me is just like, technology is a right that we have to have access. And also, like, what are the lessons that Indigenous peoples from Global South has put on the table during the pandemic and afterwards? And, like what are the lessons that we have learned from it. I would, uh, I would just summarize like this, and for me to wrap up this part, I would say like in South America, or Latin American region, um, we have also to mention that there is one experience that we have to be inspired by. It is the Quechua language available, in search engines and such as Google, and it's part also of a way to understand that languages are not only for us to, you know, to be taught uh, knowledge, but also like how we can translate that need for the rest of the generations that need to have or receive, vital information in mother languages. So I would say that. Thanks.
Thanks, David, for bringing a very big issue, especially of a digital gap, and also highlighting that despite having diversity of languages, we hardly can see such diversity when we observe the digital platform. And we are hopeful that during this decade, Indigenous peoples will have their presence of their languages in various digital platforms during these decades. And now from South America, I would like to bring you the observations and experience of Indigenous peoples from Africa. For this, I would like to invite Salden Ferris. Salden comes from Khoi Indigenous peoples from South Africa, and he is a filmmaker, a radio program producer, and a presenter. And he has been associated with Cultural Survival as a program coordinator for Africa. And the Cultural Survival is one of the pioneer organizations that supports Indigenous peoples globally and amplifies and empower the Indigenous people's voices. And Salden, you have listened to the earlier conversations, the importance of digital media that Nina presented and David presented about the challenges for Indigenous peoples to have access to digital media platforms. And from you, I would like to know, especially the opportunities. What are the opportunities which are available for Indigenous peoples of Africa in particular, or Indigenous peoples in general, for having access to or having digital inclusion, especially to have their voices heard and participate? And what are the opportunities that digital technology has? Salden.
Thank you so much, Dev. Namaste to you. And in one language in South Africa called Kweda, we greet by saying Mbambaro Khotoyo Kaha, which is just welcome and thank you for being with us today, colleagues. In another language called Nama or Kwekwe Kovap, we say Tawedis. And that is just a greeting, like saying hello. So thank you for the opportunity, Dev. Thank you to RightsCon also for allowing us to use your platform or this platform. And I'd like to just say hello to Nina, to David, and to Rinaldo. And thank you for everybody who's working behind the scenes to put this together. As far as opportunities go with access to digital platforms, Dev, I think there are many. And sometimes as Indigenous peoples, maybe through no fault of our own, we always look at ourselves as being on the other side. But the reality is that assimilation has forced us all to be part of the mainstream. So much so that we don't speak our languages as much as we should anymore. But the opportunity is in the English and the Spanish and the French that we speak. Although we don't like to speak it, we do. And these are has been the languages of instruction. That's why somebody from South Africa can understand perfectly what somebody from Nepal is communicating, and somebody from India, and my colleagues in South America. So now that we are proficient in English and Spanish and French and all of these colonial languages, the information is out there. So the opportunity lies in what is available when the internet is made available to us. And like Nina has said, it is becoming a right. We cannot live without it. So 12 years of school is of primary and secondary school is what it took for us to be proficient in mathematics and physical science and all of these things that allow us to make a living. But we have seen the change, and I'm certainly seeing the change in my children. And like Nina has also said, people who grow up with a smartphone in their hands and grow up with a computer at their disposal. So um, on so many of these platforms, education is there for free. The opportunity comes in that you don't just have to learn what they teach you at school. You can become part of the global village by certainly turning on your phone. Um, Anybody who is anywhere can learn anything. We have all of these great tools at our disposal, but like I'm saying, we always look at ourselves from the outside looking in. So why do we not look at ourselves as being part of the collective? And I'll use an example. My kids are from South Africa, 12 years old and 14 years old, but I hear them singing Korean K-pop, and they know all of the words to K-pop. And I see my colleagues are nodding, like it's going around the world. So why is it that we do not force our languages to the rest of the world? If you grew up in the time that I did, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, we know that pop culture has primarily been English and to some degree Spanish around the world. But it's a great example from the folks in Korea to say we are here as well. We can outsell Michael Jackson, just to use an example, for instance, and our languages can also go around the world. It's strange to me to hear my children singing these lyrics so fluently and they know every word. So it's a great opportunity for us to say, I am from this people and I am now able, with the opportunities that is presented to me on the internet, to build a home studio, for instance, to find a way to record music in popular music that will go around the world in my language as well, and to force this out there so that people can hear what Kwedam sounds like, or what Nama sounds like, or what Kwekwegovab sounds like, you know. So these opportunities are certainly there, and we should make use of them. Thank you, Dev.
Thank you, Salman, for highlighting that how the digital platform has enabled indigenous peoples also be a part of a global village, and also bringing the issue that how this digital media or digital technology has influenced the indigenous culture, or how this platform or digital technology has changed the behavior or modes of speaking of indigenous peoples. From Saldan, thank you, Saldan. And now from Africa now, I would like to bring the experiences of Latin America and Europe. And in order to bring the experiences and observation from the Latin American and Europe, I would like to call upon Rinaldo Morales, who was born in Peru. Currently, he lives in the United States. He is investigative journalist, educational media producer, and documentary maker. He pursued his PhD in restoration of indigenous languages, basically indigenous knowledge systems and protection of indigenous cultural and genetic resources. And he also has developed his career, including in curriculum development and digital media. And United States, Ronaldo had served for many years American Indian nations and tribes, working as educational media educators around the science and environmental education, incorporating the indigenous knowledge and culturally relevant pedagogies as well, and using the especially using the media technologies from indigenous perspective. Ronaldo, so far we have discussed about the importance, challenges, and to some extent about the opportunities that the digital technology has brought. And there is a debate that digital media have misappropriate the indigenous knowledge, skills, and despite the opportunities that Saldan had just explained about, that in digital technology has brought. So I would like to ask to share your observation and experiences regarding not a challenge, but the threat for indigenous peoples of Latin or South America in particular, or indigenous peoples in general. How the digital technology has resulted a threat in accessing the information and communication technologies, or in the day-to-day lives of indigenous peoples, right? I think the question is clear. Ronaldo, please.
Thank you very much, Dev, and thank you very much to RightCons for hosting us. I think that the important interventions from our friends pointed out the issues that the access of digital technologies for indigenous peoples was an initial struggle. We also discussed about how different communities are appropriating technology in order to develop meaningful representation, and how this is playing in different contexts across the world where indigenous peoples have lived for millennia before the creation of nation states, the nation states and societies that we have here. Only we're talking about a couple of hundred or 3 centuries ago. This is not ancient history. Indigenous peoples have had their own societies and nations until very recent. But I think so the whole issue has to be contextualized in the process of decolonization, and how decolonization and governance restoration of indigenous peoples are also becoming a form of appropriation of different means to be sustainable and to be self and autonomous governance societies. So media plays this part in the decolonization, and the way in which indigenous peoples are appropriating digital technologies has to be pointed out in that direction. So, but we must say that despite the incredible transformations of an impact of digital media and satellite communication technologies being used in the development of tribal and independent media through internet-based audiences in this new millennium, and also the advance of ethnic television that caters to specific interests, cultures, and even languages of immigrant communities in the global north. For the global mainstream masses, and from the perspective of the global south, as our brother David pointed out, indigenous peoples remain still condemned to oblivion and unable to speak to mainstream audiences about their rights and struggles. So decolonization has been viewed before as a formal process of handing over the instruments of government, and recognized now as a long-term process involving the bureaucratic, cultural, linguistic, and psychological divesting of colonial power. So when we speak about building a strategic educational communication platform on behalf of indigenous peoples, and to transform investigative science journalism capacities, those represent vital mechanisms to monitor the relationship with nation states and non-indigenous societies, to guarantee the survival and continuation of indigenous peoples' cultural, social, and economic work. Global indigenous media developed against all odds and in a very challenging conditions represents a focus on the rights, territories, and contributions to sustainable development that are not only vital for indigenous peoples, but also for governments, educational and research institutions, and for multicultural societies that are in constant motion. The meaningful mainstream media representation for indigenous peoples is necessary to play a strategic role, assisting to include global indigenous issues in the public agenda and to facilitate that, for example, United Nations agencies, as well as regional and local governments within countries, including educational and research institutions, to honor indigenous people's role in global sustainable development initiatives and as productive partners of environmental stewardship, cultural knowledge, and a biocultural relationship with the natural world for which indigenous peoples are mainly responsible. So what we're talking about is that the issue of meaningful representation for indigenous peoples emerges from this process as an essential counterpart of the obligations that nation states have ratified through treaties and conventions, all of which has critical implications for the territorial and economic development rights of indigenous peoples. So we have that since the 1980s, for example, in Latin America and many parts of the world, as Africa and the global South, we developed what we call popular alternative communication as a strategic platform to strengthen our languages, cultures, and identities, and as well as to support the resistance against the threats to our territories and our ways of life, building new scenarios for our future, leading our own development projects, and also establishing new ways to interact with mainstream languages. And for that, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, enacted in 2007, underscores, among their main tenets on collective rights, the right of self-determination as the principle of economic, social, and cultural development of world indigenous peoples. This right reflects and complements related rights as the participation in decision-making processes through government institutions and their own legislative and administrative decisions relevant to the needs of and interests of their own indigenous societies. So the implementation of meaningful representation helps to affirm the mechanisms also to free, prior, and informed consent in their own lands and territories and resources. And specifically, the declaration of the Article 16 of the International Labour Organization establishes the unique and distinct right for indigenous peoples to have their own media. Particularly, and privately owned media also should reflect cultural diversity among indigenous peoples. So we have this dynamic by which international law and national implementations, national legislation implementations, have still in a constant debate about how to act in terms of promoting and allowing and helping, assisting and funding indigenous initiatives to overcome the resistance mode of developing their own mechanisms to educate themselves, to now move into a position in which their mainstreams have to be now educated about indigenous peoples. And the movement now is not from to within our communities. The movement, and I think it's very important, is now to break these silos or this isolation in which we have been condemned by colonization, in order to sustain a process where we can educate mainstream audiences through the intensification of these presence in mainstream media and mainstream using mainstream television, for example, mainstream radio, etc. So the emergence of indigenous media is a very important balance for our world. And it's important that indigenous peoples control their own media representation, which has to be understood as a key component of the restoration and assertion of self-determined governance, knowledge production, and capacity building as mutual and equal acknowledgement among global audiences about the need for forms of justice and important political, moral, and ethical imperatives in recognition of the survivors of colonization. So the issue of media representation is key for indigenous peoples in the new time in which all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals have to be affirmed by all national legislations. With that, I would like to just give back the voice to Dev. But I think these are important contexts in which we have to understand the emergence of indigenous media.
Thank you, Ronaldo, especially bringing the necessities of the decolonization of media in order to enhance the access, voice, and participation of indigenous peoples, and also reiterating or emphasizing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples provision, Article 16, which actually guarantees indigenous peoples' right to establish their own media in their own languages, and also bringing the issue that how the digital technology has helped indigenous peoples to start alternative media platforms. And thank you, Ronaldo. And now I would like to go with the second round of questions, starting with the Nina, as you are leading the communication, the program in Asia. If I remember that the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact actually had started the network called the Indigenous Voices in Asia Network, which also massively uses this digital platforms. So I would like to listen that some of the initiatives that the Asian indigenous broadcasters or the media practitioners or the indigenous peoples in general, they have undertaken, especially in regards to use of the digital media platforms to enhance their skills and amplify their human rights. So if you share in short some of the initiatives taken in Asia, please.
Thank you, Dave. Taking over from Ronaldo, what he was saying was, the importance of having indigenous media, independent indigenous media, and that is primarily what we're trying to achieve in many various ways. One is through media fellowships, where we have partners in South Asia, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, and in India as well, where we train and mentor young indigenous journalists to be able to kind of look at the expanse of journalism from not only reportage but also different kinds of storytelling, whether it's filmmaking, whether it's using your digital skills, etc. So that's something that we've undertaken. The other that we're working on at the moment is having an open source learning platform, which is going to be a resource hub where we have a combination of modules that people can access, learning modules, data, any of the peer-reviewed journals, academic papers, anything that you'd like to kind of access. We're trying to make that knowledge accessible in the public domain. The other is obviously what we've sort of realized within our own platforms is that within our member organizations, there is definitely a reliance on their own social media platforms, because we don't get as much coverage from mainstream media, right? I mean, most mainstream media is centralized. They only come and cover indigenous people's affairs when there's a disaster or when there's some sort of sensational news that they'd like to cover. The rest of the time, they're not really interested in the larger perspectives of indigenous life, for which, of course, there is a necessity to look at building social media strategies, strengthening ourselves. That's how we control. The internet, of course, is a double-edged sword. It's something that we have obviously touched on, where it's unequal, but it's also giving us the opportunity to form our own narratives and to use those spaces and reach out to the people that we're talking to, or who are willing to ally with us, for example. So that is broadly what we are trying to achieve at the moment through various integrated methods of training, capacity building, media fellowships, etc. So that's what we are trying to undertake at the moment. Dave, over to you.
Thank you, Nina, for sharing some of the initiatives which have been undertaken in Asia in relation with the digital platforms. And now I would like to go to David. As I would like to request you also share some of the initiatives that I know you have actively involved in Latin and South Americas by bringing together the filmmakers, documentary makers together, or indigenous broadcasters, as you together with other colleagues founded the Indigenous Media Caucus at the UN itself. And we have, I mean, together undertaken some of the initiatives at the global level to give the indigenous peoples voices across the globe. And I would like to listen, your experiences or observations, how the indigenous peoples have taken the initiative, in relation to utilization of digital platform to have their say or amplify their human rights. Brother.
Thanks, Dev. Actually, yeah, I mean, like, fortunately, there are initiatives, within indigenous communities. It is, you can name or you can mention radio, digital magazines, a lot of arms of media, a lot of type of ways to communicate. But I think, and most recently we're interested in, and creating more spaces for storytelling that are linked to land defending. I'm not saying that in the past we didn't have that agenda, or that was not the reason why we're getting together organized, but more like, what is what are the people that are having that they have a say, that are not being part of the big conversation in terms of climate crisis, and what are the solutions that are being created locally, and how we can gather those narratives in cinema, for instance. And because in Latin America, starting the 80s, and there were, transference of knowledge using technology, right? But then, we were trying just to learn why we're not having much of stories that are navigating through intersections of gender, land tenure, and climate crisis, and create a metaphor out of it. So we created the Emerging Filmmakers Professional Development Program as a methodology to support through master classes given by award-winning personalities group. And also we provide personalized sessions to provide theoretical and practical narrative tools to storytellers and indigenous collectives from tropical forest. In this case, we have people from Indonesia, Brazil, Venezuela, Panama, Honduras with the Garifuna Afro-Indigenous communities, Guatemala, and they work with grassroots organizations that trace and resist dispossession and the climate crisis. So for me, I think with this dialogue that is ongoing of knowledge, we hope to continue honoring the ancestors by practicing the gift of storytelling, as practitioners of communication. So we are trying to rethink and empower our own identity and our own forms of communications towards the protection of biodiversity as well. So I think, basically is cinema, communities that are, frontliners, and technologies, within that, big framework that my brother Reynaldo mentioned, which is Article 16 of the UNDRIP. And And I think this is a very important characteristic, if I say that word, but it is very important also to mention that we are not only participating in film festivals, but we also are part of these scenarios, these important arenas where we provide recommendations to member states of the United Nations, in terms of why we need to keep on practicing this, but also we need to have access to those um, spaces of technology so we can create our own economy and be sustainable. So we don't rely always, in that inequity dynamic of power that we're always relying on the money of the state. So we can create also our means of economies, right? And yeah, I mean, the thing that gives me a lot of hope is not only the youth, but also the indigenous sisters are having different roles. Indigenous filmmakers that are women from the communities are directing, doing sound editing, they're doing photography, doing camera women. So these things are really hopeful. And I think that it's very important also to think that is a way not only to be visible, but also we have to participate, as Rinaldo mentioned, in those spaces that we can also mention statistics, that can reveal the gap, that can reveal the inequity. And even worse for indigenous sisters, that what are the roles in the communication, in terms of statistics. And that's something that we have to work a bit more. And when it comes to time for us to think also of creating policies within the framework of the states. So yeah, that's will be my say. So thanks, Dave.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. And now, as I told you in background, when we initiated the session, that the UN actually has launched the International Decade of Indigenous Languages 2022 to 2032. In 2019, there was International Year of Indigenous Languages. We just finished observing that international years, and that international year, that 1 year that came and went, and hardly some indigenous peoples knew, and they utilized that year. And I believe that during this decade, our communities will be able to utilize this decade more. And in this context, Saldan, as you are associated with cultural survival and cultural survival during the COVID-19, produced several public service announcements into indigenous languages as well. And around the world, this is not only cultural survival, but indigenous peoples actually have used the digital technologies to inform their communities in their own languages. So I would like to ask you, how helpful are the digital technologies for indigenous peoples to enhance their languages or the literacy skills, Brother Saldan? Just to remind you, we have a short time, so please, if you can be brief, I would appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dev. Yeah, what a great project we worked on at Cultural Survival. So we did more than 140 languages spoken and understood by indigenous peoples. We went to India, we went through the whole of Africa. Lots of work was done in Abya as well. And we just went all around the world, and we made use of simple technologies like people using their cell phones. So we basically wrote, I think it was 4 scripts to begin with, just understanding what coronavirus is, understanding how important vaccinations were, like 1 pages, and we used English and Spanish, and we started sending it out and just getting a feel for who would like to volunteer to take this document and translate it and record it into their indigenous language using their cell phones. For the most part, and they sent it back to us, and we had to work on editing it, and we ended up sending this very important information back to them, and through our network of more than 1,000 radio stations throughout the world, so that people could hear in languages that they speak and understand. The importance of taking care of yourself, what to eat, health, community health care was one of the topics. And this was an awesome project where everybody just came together in the face of something that was unknown, in the face of uncertainty. We had no idea how we were going to circumvent and come out on the other side, still alive. But the messages were very, very important. The public service announcements were very important. So yes, we used simple cell phone technology. We used WhatsApp. In Africa is very prevalent, as it probably is around the world. So just using WhatsApp voice notes, we would ask them to just find a quiet room and take the English script. After transcribing it into indigenous language, they would just use voice notes and send it back to us. Folks who had access to better equipment used that as well. But my brother Dev worked with us as well, and we did it in so many languages. And yeah, I think we got a taste of how important it was for us to use what we have. It was not the best quality in the world, but and sometimes you could hear chickens clucking in the background and cows grazing in the background, but we figured out how to edit it and how to put music in the background so that the message comes out, and it worked very, very well. So there's so much more that I could say, and I was so proud of. Sometimes it was just a small radio station in the middle of nowhere, and the language was really overlooked by everybody. But there were 10 people in the community that would still speak and understand that language, and they were able to hear this important messages in that language. Sometimes it would be languages that was not written at all in many years. So now there was a chance for the language to be written, So it was a great accidental way for us to ensure or to contribute in part to revitalization. And because of time, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Salden. And now we have only a few minutes left to conclude the program. So lastly, I would like to ask Ronaldo that you just give like a remark or the message for how indigenous peoples can create their own media content in the language that they speak and understand, and how they can use these digital technologies, or how these digital technologies can be helpful for them to have their voices in this digital world. Ronaldo, please, in brief.
Thank you, Deb. So we have to understand, this is for the larger audience, that we have two fronts. And indigenous peoples have two fronts in which they are developing their communications and strategies. One is the internal front, that it's related or directed to their own audiences, indigenous communities, indigenous audiences, urban or rural, tribal or non-tribal, in different levels, depending on their different needs and governance systems. The other one is the external front, and which is a much more complicated front, because as our sister Nina told, there's a huge absence on mainstream media, because they do not anyway have indigenous issues present into primetime programming, for example, and we have many different issues, and financial issues also to be present in mainstream media. That presents an issue of always having the impression that indigenous peoples do not exist across the world. So we have this challenge. We also have the dynamic of the advancement of indigenous people's rights, and we have to understand this is like a sandwich. And I see history will happen when we have these two poles connected. At the bottom, we have indigenous peoples in the field, communicators, journalists, the communities already advancing their own world and their own sustainable cultural universe. And at the top, we have people, indigenous peoples working in policy making, working at the UN and working in decision-making levels and trying to change international and legal and national legislations. Those are shrinking and are creating incredible transformations in our world. And I come from, for example, from the time where indigenous peoples' languages were completely negated. I was born in the 60s. And now I see the emergence of multinational, plurinational societies in all across the world, and the emergence of indigenous peoples is contextualized as they conquest their rightful places in the cultural and social diversity making of their nation states. So, but the question is how the emergence of indigenous languages challenging Western monolingual in colonial systems can allow us to coexist in a more productive ways with mainstream audiences. How mainstream audiences would be transformed. And this is not how indigenous people would be transformed instead, because we are already being transformed massively by mainstream media. And in many different ways, our youth, for example, is heavily influenced by mainstream and Western media and pressure to abandon their customs and cultural systems and their languages. But the important challenge is how we will transform mainstream now. And for that, we need a different terms of our meaningful representation. We have, for example, now, in the case of the community that I work at the UN, the Shipibo Konibo, they have their own radio and television that emerged also at the time of COVID. So, and we have indigenous peoples in the global north that are also concerned with this movement of making their indigenous languages mainstream. And that's the movement that we see and the challenges that we need to conquest in these new times. So this is up to us. We don't expect much that the non-indigenous societies will give us or grant us the right for our meaningful representation, but it's a matter of how we will advance in a block. And that's how we are now in a coalition with the UN Indigenous Media Caucus and in coalition and partnership with other indigenous communicators and media producers all across the world. But the challenge is now how we bridge with the non-indigenous audiences and create an indigenous mainstream. That is, I think, an important challenge that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronaldo. We have come to the end of this slated time. At last, I would like to say thank you so much for all the panelists, Nina, David, Salden, and Ronaldo, and also listeners from around the globe for your active participation. And also would like to thank to the RightCon, the organizer, for giving us this opportunity to speak up, and also giving this opportunity to moderate this session. And I would like to thank to Alan for assisting us technically to help us go live in the digital world. And would like to thank all the organizers and listeners for having this opportunity to organize this session titled Digital Technology to Enhance the Language and Literacy Skills for Indigenous Peoples, on this auspicious occasion the world's leading summit on human rights in digital world. And by now, I would like to say thank you to everyone and declare that session is over now. And thank you, everyone, and namaste.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.